I've come to the realization more than ever that truth finding and fact finding is actually a really boring and tedious endeavor. So I think in our modern climate, in our current climate, we like to find kind of the payoff in these big ways, like conspiracy theories and these kinds of things are payoffs of truth in these kind of almost cinematic, grandiose or dramatic kind of revelations. But in my experience, truth finding is in the process of a particular field. So within psychology, we have our own way of finding the truth, and it comes from years of study, and it comes from these tiny little insights from peer-reviewed studies that take months to put together. And archaeology is the same way, where it's not Indiana Jones. That's the movie version of how we find the truth. Is you just stumble upon these great discoveries that are huge, when the reality is archaeologists spend hours and hours and days muddling through mundane pottery and brushing them off with toothbrushes for hours at a time in the baking sun, and then they put together these kind of these things over time. And so for me, within the context of these different disciplines and immersing ourselves in the history of how we came to the process within this discipline and field, it's much more complicated, I think, than people want to deal with, because we just want the payoff. So for me, I want us to slow down and go back to the sciences and the scientific method and the proper processes by which we've come and built these things. We don't get iPhones because of something we read on YouTube. We get iPhones from decades and decades of really smart, patient people muddling through how the world actually works. I talk in the book about starting with our heart. So asking first, what do we hope to get out of a conversation? I think that's a really important principle, to start with the end in mind. Imagine we're beyond the argument and we're sitting around the table after the argument. How do you want to feel? What do you want the other person to be feeling? And then we have to back up from there and say, okay, what kind of words and posture and language and emotion do I need to present myself with over the next hour as we have these debates and arguments, so that we can end up there where I really want. And I think it's just important that we start by interrogating our own heart and understanding who we are and what motivates us. Is it a desire to be right? Do I really feel like I'm in a family that's so different from me and I just want to be belonging? I want to belong and I want to feel validated. And because sometimes we are good at self-sabotaging. So the thing I want to happen, I actually take the wrong route and I don't end up there, and then I get frustrated. Well, what I really wanted to do was feel loved and feel heard. And then I went at this combative, defensive approach, and I didn't get there. It's like, well, no, duh, you didn't get there. That's probably not going to be a high chance of success that way. So taking that end in mind and taking stock of where we are, what do we want, and then what's our approach to getting there. And this doesn't advocate being a doormat or, being provoked or prodded into conversations you don't want to have. There's a place for boundaries and healthy boundaries, but that's also not, we don't want to weaponize boundaries either. And so just going into it with the end in mind and checking our own motivations, and then making sure that what we're saying and doing is consistent with what we're hoping to get out of it. The first thing that comes to mind is the Bible that says perfect love casts out fear. So I think in the political climate, I'm inclined to keep asking people, what are you afraid of? And I think that's a hard question for people to answer, because they'll often say, I'm not afraid of anything. They're just wrong. And but if you get into conversation, you start to hear what the picture of, if they, quote unquote, if they win, what our world will look like in 4 or 5 years. If they start painting that picture, you start to understand their fear. Their fear is that that's the world that we'll be living in. So I think we have to take stock of our own fears and see how those are playing out in our conversations, because that, if you truly believe that that's what's going to happen, it's hard not to get emotional about these things. So taking stock of our fear and asking, is it reasonable? But also, do I want to live in fear? Even if that is reasonable. Do I want to put fear into the world? Do I want to put love into the world? Do I want to put anger into the world? And so being able to take stock of our fears, I think, is important. But also learning this real difficult and delicate trick of standing up for our beliefs without putting others down. How do we feel like we have this choice again, the choice between truth and love, which often is, do I stand up for what I believe, or do I just keep my mouth shut and let people kind of run all over me? And I think that's a false dichotomy. There's a way to stand up for who we are and what we believe without putting others down, without being the very thing that we're against. And that's the trick. That's the wisdom of what does it mean to love in this situation, where I can say, listen, we see it differently. I disagree with you. We can talk about the ways we disagree, but I want you to know I love you. I care about you. And this isn't going to change our relationship. I mean, I would say I really appreciate the beginning chapters on wrestling ourselves away from the idea of absolute truth, because I think that's where some of our challenges, because on the flip side of that, there's a deep humility. Our conversations around all of this, I think, for it to be constructive, needs to be rooted in humility. And part of that humility is recognizing that we're limited and we don't have access to everything and to all the facts. And we see this in history. And so we have to kind of contextualize ourselves in this great narrative of which we are a small part, of which we've inherited so much, and of which there still is no end in sight. I think for me, I like rereading that because I still think it's pretty foundational to starting this conversation well.